Hey, everybody, welcome. I'm going to preface this by saying I'm feeling much better. I've had a cold, wasn't COVID, I tested, but I still have a bit of an iffy voice. So we will continue as long as my voice lasts. Welcome. For those of you who might be new, my name is Lori Hellis. I'm a retired criminal attorney, and I moved to Boise, Idaho in order to cover the Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell case for a book I'm writing. And we do true crime every Wednesday. So welcome. And I'm going to preface this by saying there's not a lot of huge information happening this week, but a few interesting things that I think we'll just talk a little bit about a lot of things, and then we'll take your questions. So I'm going to start out while we're kind of waiting for folks to join. I want to talk a little bit about Dylan Round's case. For those of you who are not familiar, Dylan Rounds was a 19-year-old young man who was an avid farmer and rancher and very much wanted his own ranch. And so he moved out to a remote area in Utah and was dry farming. And he met and went awry with a man who was squatting on his property and disappeared about a year ago. A man whose name is James Brenner, who has a long criminal history, including violent crime, is under arrest for his murder, but his body has not yet been found. Authorities felt that there was sufficient evidence to indict him in spite of that. He is also being held on some federal weapons charges because he is a convicted felon. And so at this point, they have not done a preliminary hearing yet. The next hearing for him is scheduled for the 31st of July, which is also Lori Vallow Daybell's sentencing date. And we've yet to see him be indicted or them to set a trial date. It's cumbersome when he is in federal custody because it means every time they want to have a state court hearing, they have to do a bunch of paperwork. It takes weeks, and then they have to transport him. So it's not a simple thing. A couple of things that were interesting that were in the news. The case of Matthew Nilo, Nilo. He is lives in New Jersey, practices law as an attorney for a Manhattan, New York firm. And 16 years ago, he was arrested recently for 4 rapes. The oldest of one, which happened 16 years ago in Boston, before he was a lawyer. And they discovered the connection by DNA genealogy. Now, we've seen this. This helped identify Brian Kohberger and has helped to identify several high-profile cases recently. He was at some sort of a dinner event, and they picked up the silverware that he had used and tested the utensils and were able to positively identify him from DNA that was collected during the at the rape scenes. So that's kind of interesting, and it's an old case, 16 years ago. So unsolved cases are being solved by using this current technology. Lots of people have been talking about 6 deaths in Portland, Oregon, and I have to tell you, I think this has been totally blown out of proportion. There have been 6 women murdered in a 100-mile radius, and there's all this speculation going on that it may be the work of a serial killer. However, at this point, law enforcement keeps saying no reason to believe that the cases are related. So that will be kind of an interesting one to keep an eye on. A couple things I wanted to bring to your attention. There is a new video documentary series on Amazon, and it is about the Duggar family. Those of you who might remember them from the TLC show, I think it started as 16 kids and counting and got as high as 19 kids and counting. This is a family who belonged to a evangelical Christian group that borders on a cult, and the children were all homeschooled, and there were a lot of problems with the organization. The founder of the organization was accused of impropriety, and one of the Duggar sons was accused of he initially was accused of having had inappropriate contact with young girls, including his two younger sisters, and then later was found to be in possession of images of children. Oh, thanks. I just saw somebody in the chat remark about my, over here, flowers. Those were an anniversary gift from my husband. Our anniversary was a couple days ago. So that video series is quite interesting. There's a lot of information coming out about that group and about the Duggar family, and so it's very interesting. It is interesting from this standpoint that although it hasn't been classified as a cult, this religious organization has a lot of the same hallmarks as, say, the Daybell case. So that made it really interesting. I will say that I noticed on Facebook that Heather Daybell remarked that she had just watched it and certainly felt that anybody who's been involved in a high demand religion could relate to the program. So Joran van der Sloot has been extradited back to the United States, and that is associated with the Natalee Holloway case. Those of you who may remember, Natalee Holloway disappeared while she was on a high school senior trip to Aruba, I believe. And Joran van der Sloot was always, and his father, with his father's assistance, it's always been believed that he was involved in Natalee's death. She disappeared. Her body was never found. And it was always believed that Joran van der Sloot murdered her. He was from Holland or Netherlands, and he then fled to South America. And he was arrested in South America for murdering a woman there and was in prison there. He has been extradited to the United States. The trial is not for Natalee's death, unfortunately. It is for his attempt to extort money out of Natalee's mother, Beth, to tell her the location of Natalee's body. So that will be interesting to watch once it gets underway. There are a couple of interesting cases that are related to the Parkland school shooting. So during the Parkland case, there were complaints that the school security officer was negligent in that he didn't do anything. He stood outside and didn't do anything when he heard the shooters shooting up the school. This guy's name is Scott Peterson, and he has been charged with multiple counts of child neglect, negligence, and perjury. What was interesting was they just started the hearing, and they were playing the video or the audio of recording of what was happening inside the school. And it was chilling. You can hear screaming and you can hear the gunshots, and it was absolutely chilling. If you are at all sensitive, it is not something you want to watch. The other thing that was so interesting was information came out today that Elizabeth Scherer, who was the judge in the penalty phase for the Parkland shooter, was disciplined and censured over her behavior in court. This is another one. If you want to see a bad acting judge, and believe me, I've seen a couple of these, she is at the, if Judge Newman is the gold standard, this woman is the sewer standard. It was absolutely shocking, her behavior during this penalty phase. The council that, or panel that reviewed the case, censured her and said her emotions overcame her judgment. She time and time again went after the defense and clearly was biased towards the prosecution. At the end of the case, she hugged every member of the prosecution while still in her judicial robe. And not coincidentally, she just announced that she is retiring from the bench on the 30th of this month. Her behavior was absolutely reprehensible. And I have appeared in front of judges like this before. And I'll tell you what, it isn't fun. It isn't, you're just there trying to do your job, and you're trying to stay professional, and the judge has just lost sight of the fact that that black robe does not give you unlimited power. So I was thrilled to see that in Florida, the Judicial Fitness Council was willing to look into her behavior. I wish it happened more often, but it doesn't. And that probably leads me into a conversation about Judge Boyce and his behavior as well. Those of you who have seen his response to my latest request to unseal documents, he clearly was being personal and insulting. And I thought it was absolutely fascinating that during my audience with him, after he made me leave the courtroom, he said to me, "I don't know why you think I know you. The only reason I know your name is because your phone went off in my courtroom in Fremont County months before." And I was stunned then, because I couldn't figure out how he didn't recognize my name from the motions I'd filed. And then lo and behold, in his response to my renewed request to unseal the documents, he had a real field day going after me. So he certainly remembered who I am. And but what I will say is, in my opinion, and this is my personal opinion, the culture in Rexburg means that truth is what I say it is. If I say it's true, because I'm white and I'm male. And that is the mentality in Rexburg, Idaho. I will leave you to draw conclusions about why that is. There was a little bit of news out of the Kohberger case. The Kohberger's attorneys yesterday filed the judge in that case at the last hearing asked both sides to present argument having to do with whether or not there will be cameras in the courtroom. And the defense asked the court not to allow cameras in the courtroom, cited all of the opinions from Judge Boyce in the Daybell case, and then provided the court with a 50-page document asking them to take judicial notice of screenshots of podcasts and photos and all social media posts. So it will be interesting to see that the next hearing, I believe that the hearing that will determine the cameras in a courtroom and where the judge will review the gag order happens on June 26th. And then really the last one that I really wanted to talk about, and this one I'd really like to sort of dive into and talk a little more in depth about this, is the Travis Rudolph case. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the case, Travis Rudolph is an ex-NFL football player. He was under contract with the Canadian Football League, which happens a lot when players are trying to improve their standing so they can get back into the NFL. He was living in Florida, and he had a girlfriend whose name is Dominique. And he and Dominique had sort of a stormy relationship and lots of ups and downs. There were witnesses who, now I want to preface this by saying I did not listen to every witness in the case. I listened to most of the main witnesses and I listened to the closing arguments. So, but there were neighbors in Travis Rudolph's neighborhood who complained that Dominique was constantly, they were fighting all the time. It was loud, and that she was physically abusive to him. There was no evidence that he was physically abusive to her. She alleged that on the night of this incident, he pushed her down. There's a Ring camera video, like most Ring, like a lot of home surveillance videos. It's kind of inconclusive. He may have pushed her down. She also may have slipped and fallen. It's pretty inconclusive. There was also video from a couple of neighbors' home surveillance systems that was presented. All of it was not great quality, and so difficult to say for sure what was happening. So what happened was Travis Rudolph gets into an argument with his girlfriend, Dominique. She thinks he's cheating. They get into an argument. He admits he's cheating, that he's been seeing someone else. She gets angry, gathers up all her belongings, storms out of the house, either fell or was pushed on the way out, and gets in her car and leaves. On the way home, she texts her brother, "Y'all need to go over and shoot up Travis's shit." There are phone conversations between her and the brother as well, where she obviously she has a conversation with him about what happened. And lo and behold, her brother and 3 of his friends drive over to Travis's house, pound on the door. It's like midnight, pounding on the door and telling him he needs to get out there. Travis goes to the door and goes outside to talk to these guys. He is not armed. He stands in the doorway, and it's clear that these guys don't want to talk to him. They are there to do a beatdown. So one of the guys goes after him. It's 4-on-1. Pretty soon, Travis's younger brother comes out to try and get him off Travis. There's a kind of a free-for-all melee. His mom comes out. She's trying to calm things down. Now, nobody's calling the police. And it's Florida. All of the people involved are African American. And I think they have a real, maybe justified suspicion about an aversion to calling the police. So nobody calls the police. Travis then realizes that at least one of these guys has got a gun. It's in a pocket or in his waistband. And he then goes into his home and comes back out with a gun. Travis owns 2 guns. He owns a handgun that he has a concealed carry permit for, and he owns some sort of semi-automatic rifle. And because I'm not a gun expert, they talk about the kind of gun. I'm just not a gun expert. So he comes back out with this rifle. The rifle has a drum magazine, which is a high capacity magazine. Now, the defense makes a point of the fact that all of these firearms that he owns are legal, and he obtained them legally. He has a concealed carry permit, but he comes out with the gun. His mother says, wait a minute. No, don't escalate this. But Travis realizes that his younger brother is still getting a beat down from these 3 other guys. And they've all headed up the block to where their car is. And the brother is up there close to their car, and he's getting beat down. So Travis says, no, they've got, I think the kid's name is Daryl, the younger brother. They've got Daryl. And he then heads up the block with his rifle to try and stop them from beating the kid down. Now, Travis testified, and on the stand, here's what he said happened. He said he saw a gun. One of the guys had a gun in his pocket. He then, when he got to the car, he looked up, and there were 2 people inside the car pointing guns at him. And at that point, he started firing. As is common when not even a civilian, but when someone shoots, it's not unusual for them to just keep shooting. I mean, people often empty the gun and then keep shooting even when the gun is empty. So he fires in very quick succession, because this is a semi-automatic gun, 39 rounds. And he fires them into the car. The car then, the driver does sort of a 3-point turn, and they drive away. They drive away. There's a dispute about where they go and what happens next. But at some point, it appears that they stop the car and get rid of weapons. They drive on, and the car is damaged by all of this gunfire, and it dies. And they say they're on their way to the hospital because at least one of the guys that's in the car is very badly injured. As it turns out, one passenger dies before he gets to the hospital, and the other one survives his wounds. So the police come, and there's no question from the testimony that there were some real deficits in the investigation. The police come and talk to the guys in the car. The guys in the car say, "Oh man, we were driving away. We didn't have guns, and this guy shot us." Well, then as the investigation goes on, it becomes evident that they did have, that at least some of them were armed, and that there were guns in the car. So, but they arrest Travis Rudolph and charge him with first-degree murder. He says it's self-defense. So tonight is what I want to talk about, self-defense, because it's an interesting, there are some interesting points to be had about understanding the legal technicalities of self-defense. And y'all like to come and get in the weeds with me when it gets to the legal stuff. So Travis Rudolph claims that he was in fear of his life. He was in fear that they were going to kill his brother. And he could see guns pointed at him, and he shot at them before they shot. So the defense said this is a clear-cut case of self-defense. The prosecution said, oh, no, because he had the opportunity to cool off. The cooling off thing is not necessarily a self-defense argument usually. Usually it is somebody who was provoked in the heat of passion. It's much more the you walk into a room and discover that this person is abusing your 4-year-old child, and you see red and you kill him and you shoot him dead. So that's different, that, extreme emotional distress. So, but what the prosecution was saying is that Travis was the aggressor because they were running away and he was shooting. So let's talk a little bit about the theory of self-defense. In the law, there are a few what we call affirmative defenses. One of them is self-defense. One is not guilty by reason of insanity. One is defense of others. There is a defense for choice of evils. I took the least bad of a whole bunch of bad alternatives. So self-defense is the one that comes up probably most often. And states vary. I don't know how long my voice is going to hold out, so bear with me. We've also had a lot of thunderstorm activity around the Boise area all night last night, all evening tonight. And earlier when we were having a lot of lightning, the lights were flashing. So if I lose power and lose you, know that I'll be back. But probably not until next week. So back to self-defense. States vary on their theories about self-defense. So in a lot of states, the person who is defending themselves is required to retreat if possible. And they really have to be sort of backed in a corner with no other alternative. So let's think of an example. So let's say that you're at your kid's baseball game and you're the umpire at your kid's baseball game. And you call a kid out. And the kid's dad, who's a real hothead, thinks his kid was safe. And he starts yelling from the bleachers, calling you names, screaming and hollering at you, threatening you. I'm going to come down and kick your ass, But he doesn't do anything. He doesn't take any action to actually do anything to carry out his threats. You are not permitted to use any sort of defense against him because there's no overt, true act of aggression. It's just talk. So, but let's say the game is over and you go to your car, and when you get to your car, he's waiting there for you. Now here comes a question. The guy's got a baseball bat and he's standing next to his car with a baseball bat. In a lot of states, that the law would say, if you have the ability to leave or get away, then it's not self-defense. So the guy's standing next to his car and he is menacing you, but you can get in your car and drive away. You cannot, under the law, use deadly force against him. However, change the facts a little bit because that's what lawyers do. And let's say he is standing between you and your driver's side door, and you cannot get into your car. This is a different situation because now there's no escape for you. He's blocking your way of getting out of there. Additionally, we have a young child who there's an argument could be defensive of others, particularly if that other person is young or is a particular, an especially vulnerable victim. So, but in a lot of states, and Florida is one of them, they have what they call a stand your ground law. And that means that you do not have to retreat. So if the guy comes at you with a baseball bat and you could get in your car and leave, you don't have to. You could shoot them instead. As long as you can reasonably say, I was in fear for my life. This guy was going to come after me with a baseball bat. He's a big guy. He'd been drinking. He was verbally abusing me earlier. I was worried for my child. And the only alternative I had was to pull out my gun, which I am licensed to conceal carry, and shoot him. So, and in a lot of states, you don't even have to be licensed to conceal carry. You can open carry. So in the Rudolph case, Florida has a stand your ground law. So it wasn't a question of, was he obligated to retreat? He went there to try and make sure his brother was okay, which is a defense of others. And in the process, looks down the barrel of what he says are two people pointing guns, one through the windshield and one, the passenger door was cracked open. And in that space between the door and the body of the car, there was another gun. So both sides gave, if you want to hear a couple of excellent closing arguments, go and listen to the closings in this Travis Rudolph case. I thought the prosecution and the defense both gave excellent closings. And I mean, it was kind of textbook. I mean, it was the kind of closings that you think, wow, that's something that you would use as a teaching tool. So they both gave really great closings, and the jury went to deliberate, and the jury deliberated for 3 hours and came back with a not guilty on all the charges. So it appears that the jury believed Travis Rudolph that, in fact, he was in fear of his life because he was found not guilty on all charges, and left the courtroom a free man. So it was a very interesting trial to watch. It was interesting as a social, I don't know, as a social experiment, maybe. I don't know. They were all young. All of the people that were involved were all young, very tech savvy kind of folks. The young woman who was the jilted girlfriend was really interesting to see on the stand. She was very confrontational with the defense. She was there as a prosecution witness, and the prosecution was absolutely convinced that, you know, she didn't have anything to do with this, that this was Travis because he didn't like that these guys showed up and disrespected him. It appeared to me to be much more than just a bunch of young guys with too much testosterone dissing each other. So it was really interesting. And it also was interesting. The one thing I don't know, is the the demographic of the jury, the makeup of the jury, how many men, how many women, what their ethnicity was, because that would have been really interesting to know. But I didn't feel like the young guys who were involved in the beatdown and the 3 surviving victims, I didn't feel like any of them really acquitted themselves very well. They were kind of cocky and snipey and kind of unpleasant. And so was the ex-girlfriend. And then Travis Rudolph got on the stand, and, certainly he had been coached. And he was very soft-spoken, very well-spoken. And I think he was just believable. So obviously the jury believed him, and the jury didn't believe the victims. And there were a lot of, it was interesting. Apparently Florida allows depositions in criminal cases. Most states don't. And so there were many occasions where the defense attorney was pulling out prior depositions and saying, but didn't you say this here? Didn't you say that there? And it certainly made them look suspicious and a little evasive. So it was super interesting. Like I say, if you want to see a really good closings on both sides, that would be one to watch. So Travis Rudolph went home today, a free man, which is after 2 years of being under the shadow of this murder trial. I'm sure is a huge relief to him. So, it does prove that our system works, that there are times that the state brings a case and the jury says, we don't see it. We don't believe it. We don't believe the witnesses. We don't see the crime. And this certainly was a case. There was never any dispute that Travis Rudolph fired those shots and that those shots were responsible for the death of one of those 4 guys and the injury of another. That wasn't the question. The question was whether at the time he was in fear of his life, and the jury believed him. So interesting days. I don't know how long my voice is going to hold out, so I think we'll go ahead and take some questions. While Michelle is working on that, though, I do want to tell everybody CrimeCon is coming up. It's coming up in September, and it will be in Orlando, Florida. So you East Coast folks, you should be thinking about joining us. It is great fun. It is super fun. And there are just lots and lots of people to meet and things to see, really interesting panel discussions. If you want to meet the people your favorite podcasters, that's the place to go. Gigi will be there. Scott Reich will be there. Joel Waldman from Surviving the Survivor and his mom Carm will be there. I'm going to be there. There are going to be a lot of folks there, and it's always a really interesting and fun time. So that is happening starting the weekend of September 20th in Orlando, and you can Google crimecon.com and you can find out. But here's the bigger news for me and you all, maybe, I hope. Next year's CrimeCon is going to be in May. They seem to go spring on the West Coast, fall on the East Coast. Seems to be sort of their pattern. So last year it was in April and it was in Las Vegas. Next year it's going to be May 31st through June 2nd. I think that's right. And we don't know location yet. They say they don't announce a location until this year's CrimeCon. So we won't know until September what the location is going to be. But I've been talking to my publisher about the book, and it's really cool. Things are starting to move along. We're working on a book cover, and we're shooting to launch the book at CrimeCon, May 31st of next year. The book will be out on the shelf in September, so we will be doing pre-orders and launching the book in May at CrimeCon. I'm super excited about it. I don't have a lot of the details firmed up yet, but if you were going to go to CrimeCon, you ought to come to this one, because we're going to have a launch party. It's going to be a blast. So mark your calendars for May 31st, that weekend, for CrimeCon. I think it's going to be somewhere here on the West Coast, could be Vegas again. And be there or be square, because it's going to be a big celebration. And I would love to see as many people as can join us. Hi, Janet. Question about Travis's case. What are your thoughts about how the judge allowed Dominique to be so disrespectful to the defense and even to him? I thought it was an interesting call on his part. You know, I've been in front of judges before that will brook none of this, and they will just shut somebody down really fast. But I've also been in front of judges whose technique is to let that person make themselves look bad. And I thought the judge just allowed Dominique to dig her own hole, because she came off as bitchy and bitter and insincere about a lot of things. She came off as not being credible. So I thought he kind of let her sink her own ship, because I think the jury was not impressed with her. And I think they took one look at her and thought, honey, if I were him, I would have set you packing too. So I think this judge's decision was let her go and let her sink her own boat. So, but that's a good question, because there are some judges that certainly would not have let her get away with some of that stuff. Hi, Kathleen. Thank you so much for the super sticker. As y'all know, all of our super chat donations and PayPal donations go to our moderator. Kelly Vieser, can Rudolph also sue the state to recoup monies for his attorney fee now that he's been proven innocent? I heard lawyers are around $500,000. No, because I don't think that he could prove that this was a wrongful prosecution. I think he would have to go a ways. I think he could reasonably say, you know, once the police had me in handcuffs, which they did say, they didn't think they needed to do any further investigation on the case. And so the investigation was sloppy, but I don't think this rises to a wrongful prosecution. And that's the place where you really have to go to get a lawsuit. Because remember, government employees have a certain level of immunity. There's a sovereign immunity that goes on when it comes to being able to sue the government, whether it's the prosecution or whether it's the police. The basis for the suit has to rise to the level of negligence or recklessness. And I don't think they get there with this case. But that's a great question. And I'm sure his defense did cost that, because it was a rigorous defense. But it got him a not guilty verdict. Hi, Dolly. What's the book cover going to look like? You know, I'm not trying to be super secretive, because when I have a book cover, you all will see it. But at this point, I don't know yet. The publisher has made some suggestions. I've sent some pictures. We're sort of kicking around some ideas, but I think I don't think we know enough yet about. But I think you will see something more upmarket, which is what they want. They want something that is not. It will not be pictures of any of the players, because I'm the last two books that have come out, and this is no knock on Leah Sotilli. Her book is fabulous, but she has pictures of Chad and Lori on the front of her book. John Glatt, his picture is his cover is Lori, and that's not where I want to focus. So I know it won't be them, but we're still working on it. We're talking about trying to work in the lone tree that JJ was buried under. So we don't. It's not for sure yet, but when it is for sure, you'll know. Hi, Kathleen. Will your book mostly focus on Lori? How will you integrate the info from her trial since Judge Boyce won't release the evidence presented in her case? Well, I'm going to do my best to get as much information as I can, and certainly we'll be talking about the evidence that was presented at trial, which is what found her guilty. So we'll be talking about that. And I have not given up getting this information. So, and, to be honest, a lot of information is in the Gilbert and Chandler FOIA document dumps. There was not a lot of information that wasn't. I think really the only thing that we didn't have was the phone extractions, and there's I think enough in the trial transcripts or the trial recordings to be able to pinpoint that. So I'm about 10,000 words in, so I'm feeling pretty good about where I'm at so far. We all overwrite, so I don't know how many of those 10,000 words will end up in the final book, but writing it in that way means that there's plenty of room to edit and to make sure it's the best it possibly can be. So I'm gonna do my best to flesh out what has been a fascinating case. Hi, text lately, I think. Although Lori did not present a mental health defense, is John Pryor allowed to bring up her mental health diagnosis as part of his defense? For example, she was crazy and he was smitten and she went along. You bet. Absolutely. I don't know that he could go as far as presenting her mental health diagnosis, but he certainly could present his own experts and ask for them to give their opinion. Absolutely. And I would. That he was smitten. He had no idea how mentally ill she was. He didn't know until she was arrested and got committed. She was good at hiding it. Yeah, all of that. Is it going to do him any good? I don't know. And I mean, I still think that his best bet at this point is to try and get rid of the death penalty and take a plea, because the death penalty is still on the table. Now, I mean, realistically, is he going to be executed? Well, there's a guy on death row right now who's been there 35 years. Realistically, no. One of the two Lafferty brothers that committed the murders that are depicted in Under the Banner of Heaven, John Krakauer's book, that was the mid-'80s. One of them died in prison, and the other one wasn't subject to the death penalty. I don't remember why, but Only one of the two brothers got the death penalty. The one who got the death penalty died in prison. The other one is still serving a life term. So, you know, I don't know what the value would be of Chad going to trial at this point. If the state's willing to take the death penalty off, I think he'd be very smart to take the deal. I think that's kind of the consensus of everybody I've talked to or listened to. So, you know, I think we've got a little ways to go before we determine that. I certainly think they want to know what Lori's sentence is actually going to be, because I think they're going to try and duplicate that for Chad. So I don't think we'll see any movement on Chad's case until after her sentencing on July 31st. You know, I really appreciate the fact that you guys, we've been together a while, and we've been working through these questions and getting educated about the law and how criminal law works. So I don't get lightweight questions from you. I get thought-provoking questions, and I really appreciate that. And we get compliments all the time on how great our chat is, how welcoming it is, and how smart y'all are. Hi, Susie Gay. Is Boyce's decision on documents remaining sealed until after Chad's trial going to affect your writing schedule? Nope. To be honest, I don't think that there is that much in those documents that will impact the trajectory of the book. Now, having said that, there are documents that I think are important to the story that I may not get, but they don't have to do with the trial and Lori and what happened with the trial. They have to do with Judge Boyce and the prosecutors and things that were going on early in this case. I would very much like to address that. I don't know whether I will be able to or not. So we will see. I think that Judge Boyce's most recent communication and him doubling down on not releasing documents and the way that he did it, and as insulting as he was, says way more about his character than it does about mine. And I'm just going to let that go. So writing schedule is on schedule. I have promised my publisher a first manuscript by the end of the year. And unless something huge happens, I'm going to stick to that schedule so that we can all get together and party like fools in May of 2024 at CrimeCon. Hi, Jill. Do you think Chad's trial will really start on April 1st? That's 2024, or will Pryor get it delayed more? You know, the court's given him an entire year beyond Lori's trial. I mean, he will have gotten 12 months. I cannot imagine the judge allowing him to delay that a second more. It will have been nearly 4 years since all of this started. So I cannot imagine the judge allowing any further delays. I mean, he gave Pryor way more time than I think he had to. So I don't think so. But I mean, I still think there's a 50-50 chance it'll never go to trial because Chad's going to plead. Denicia Rose. Do you have options to go above Judge Boyce? His bias is so blatantly obvious, I don't understand how it's legal. I could make a complaint, and I might. I'm still thinking about how to approach this. So will I give up and not press for the sealed documents? Hell no. If he thinks I'm going to give up, he doesn't know me very well. So, my motto is underestimate me. That'll be fun. No, I'm not giving up on getting the documents, and I will continue to press forward to getting those documents unsealed. He doesn't want to unseal them. I don't know where that's going to go. I don't know where it's going to take me. What I will say is Idaho is a very different environment. And I've seen it not just in the Daybell case, but I am coming to realize that in many ways, Idaho is a little backward in the way that they manage cases, in the way that they prosecute, in the way that they, in general, behave. And that is not limited to Eastern Idaho communities that are heavily LDS. I see in Idaho, I see the other areas I've practiced in 20 or 30 years ago, in terms of the way that they treat people, the way that they prosecute cases, so we'll see. I haven't made up my mind yet about how I'm going to go forward when it comes to Judge Boyce. I may just continue to be really professional and give him enough rope to hang himself, the same way that the public defenders did in the Florida case, in the Parkland shooting case. The defense attorneys in that case stayed really professional, pushed back when they felt that they could, and let her melt down and throw temper tantrums and embarrass herself and let her emotions cloud her judgment to the point where she was censured and now is off the bench. So I think that's a possibility too. I'm not going to give up, so I will continue to push, and I'm certain that at some point, I would say if he's betting on me backing off or on me melting down, neither one of those things are going to happen. But I'm not betting on him not melting down. So, hi, Beth. If the sealed documents reveal any misconduct, can it lead to the verdict being overturned? Seems like something is being kept secret. I think it depends upon the level of misconduct, and that would be an issue for the appellate court to decide. So certainly I think that if, as I believe, there is that level of misconduct, then I think it's possible that that could become an appellate issue. Now, let's remember that because the death penalty came off the table, Lori has fewer options for appeal. She has fewer post-conviction actions. So I think it's possible. I think it will depend on how bad the appellate court thinks the misconduct is. So, and I know that the defense attorneys know about this misconduct, and I know that they at times have tried to bring it to people's attention. So we will have to wait and see. Hi, Linda. What's the most interesting trial you've ever followed? Well, there were several pretty interesting trials that I was either involved in or sort of peripherally involved in. One that I didn't represent anyone in, but was a case that happened in Bend where I practiced, and that was a case where 5 young people, one over 18, and the rest under 18, I think. They all got together. They were drinking alcohol a lot, and they decided that they needed one guy's mom's car, and they were going to steal her car. She was a single mom, not a lot of money. The kids were all at her home, and they initially decided they were going to steal her car. It then escalated to, if we're going to steal her car, we need to make it look like a robbery. And then from there, it went to, if we're going to steal her car, we need to kill her. And so they started out, I mean, it was awful. They hit her over the head. When she didn't die, then they shot her. And this was the mother of one of these 5 kids. There were 2 girls and 3 guys. And the guy who pulled the trigger was a juvenile. But in Oregon, kids over 15 who commit certain crimes can be remanded to adult court. So they were all remanded to adult court. One of the girls was 14, and she was treated as a juvenile. And so she entered a plea, an admission in juvenile court, and was sentenced to a lengthy time in the state juvenile facility, and then was released when she became an adult. The other 4 were convicted of varying degrees. Only one went to trial, and then the others pled out. And they were all, I think it was an interesting case because they were all juveniles, and because it was right about the time that the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, was coming out with a ruling really clarifying that young people, minors, should be treated differently. There are a lot of states like Oregon who have mandatory sentencing schemes. Arizona does as well, where if you are convicted of crime X, you will get sentence X, and there is no leeway for the judge. And that same sentencing scheme also says if you are this age, you can be remanded to adult court and you will get that sentence. So in the case of the guy who actually committed the murder, he received life without parole. A couple of the other younger people, that the prosecution was working hard for that same sentence for them, even though they were minors. So in that case, what happens is they serve until they age out of the youth authority, in the custody of the youth authority, and then they graduate to adult prison. And there was a lot of controversy about the U.S. Supreme Court had just come out with this decision saying youth are different and should not necessarily receive the same kind of mandatory sentences. So it had some interesting legal issues. It was a very sad case. And my understanding is that the first of them are are eligible to be released. I think the young woman who was that was young enough that she was in the youth authority, I think she's now been released. So, I did a lot of juvenile work, and I have some real opinions about whether or not we should be treating juveniles as adults at age 15. So that's the defense lawyer in me, I guess. Who do you think wants to bring the case to trial more, John Pryor or Chad Daybell? I think that John Pryor, unlike Lori's attorneys, has been thoroughly preparing to go to trial. And I don't know that he wants to go to trial. I don't know that that's ever really a calculus as a lawyer. I think we're called upon to zealously represent our clients and to professionally, adequately prepare to do that. So I don't know if I don't know if John Pryor really has an opinion either way. I mean, I think it's his job to tell Chad, if you want to go to trial, we'll go to trial, and I will be as prepared as I possibly can be to go to trial. On the other hand, I think there are certain reasons why you should consider a plea. So, I mean, Pryor he sat through most of the trial. He's had an opportunity to look at how the state presented all that discovery. And I think what we've heard at different times is that the case against Chad is even a little stronger than the case was against Lori. And so I think the prosecution is confident that they're in their case. And I think John Pryor is going to do the best job possible. I think that he's certainly putting a lot more into it than Lori's public defenders did. And I think he'll be ready, whether he wants to bring the case to trial or not. I mean, I don't know that that's, I mean, maybe some lawyers are like, yeah, let's get in there and rock and roll. But, for the most part, we know that that's our job. And that we owe it to our clients to be as prepared as possible. But ultimately, the decision's Chad's. I mean, whether or not to go to trial or take a plea, whether or not to take the stand and testify, I think those are decisions that are solely the client's to make. Good question, though. Hi, Beth. We recognize that juveniles can't vote or drink, so how can they form the same intent as an adult? There has to be some middle ground alternative. I'm with you. So, having done a lot of juvenile work, including representing juveniles in violent crime situations, I've done a fair amount of educating myself about juvenile brain development, and I have consulted with some really, really super smart people who are experts on children who kill. And so I think what we know about brain development, this isn't the first time I have used this example, but back when I was young, we thought that the human brain was fully formed when a kid got to be somewhere around 5 years old. What we know now is that brain development takes sometimes until young people are well into their 20s. So what we know is that when a baby's born, their brain starts to make all these synaptic connections, starting from the brain stem and working forward. And the last part that really gets finished is the part right behind your forehead, your frontal lobe. And that's where all of your judgment is, where all of your higher thinking happens. So what we know is that between birth and about 10 to 12 years old, the brain does this massive overgrowth of synaptic connections. And when a kid gets to be, we think it has something to do, it's triggered by puberty. When a kid gets to be about 12, you start to see the brain pruning some synapses and reinforcing others. So the brain lays down this substance called myelin, and that it is the same stuff that sheaths our nerves. If you have carpal tunnel, that's what they release, is the myelin sheath around your nerves. And what the brain is doing is it's getting rid of synaptic connections that aren't being used and focusing the energy on the synaptic connections that are being used. So I always use this example. We adults who've been driving cars for a long time, we see a four-way stop and we know what to do. Our body just muscle memory does it, and we don't think about it. But a young person who's now learning to drive comes to a four-way stop, and they have to stop because the synaptic cluster of brain cells and the connections between that cluster of brain cells isn't formed yet. So they come to a four-way stop and they have to stop and think, okay, four-way stop. What do? I put my foot on the brake. I stop. Now I have to figure out who was first at the stop sign, who's on my right. Then I have to figure out whether or not I need to turn on my blinker and which way is for left and which way is for right. All of these things we don't think about because the neural pathway that tells us what to do, the connections that connect up that cluster of brain cells that tell us what to do at a four-way stop, that neural pathway is like a superhighway where the kid who's just learning to drive, that neural pathway is like a little trail, a little game trail in the forest. So that's what's going on all over that kid's body. What we know is that when kids are going through this big rewiring, pruning that happens in about middle school age, that's why you have a middle schooler who one day knows what 6 times 6 is, and the next day can't tell you. It may very well be because the brain improperly pruned the 6 times 6 memory. So we find in middle school teachers will tell you middle school classes are more repetitive than at any other time in a kid's school life because kids have so much more, so much trouble with these overpruned synaptic connections. So we know that brain development, that young people's brains aren't done until they're 21 or older. I think the most frightening time for me as a mom was the time between the ages of 18 and 21. Here's my kid. She's graduated from high school. She's off to college, and yet she's not old enough to drink, and her brain isn't really fully completed understanding maybe why things that she might think about doing aren't such good ideas. So I do think that there needs to be a middle ground, and we need to be a little bit less black and white. Now, a lot of these mandatory sentencing schemes came in the early to mid 90s, and they were a reaction and the pendulum swinging to a more conservative approach to criminal justice. And we have seen in the last 30 or so years, the pendulum start to swing back the other way. So we're seeing many more states go to treatment models. We're seeing lots more states trying to put money into drug and alcohol treatment, into mental health treatment in the jails and prisons. we're seeing a lot more of that of that emphasis, and a lot less on the let's lock them up and for the rest of their life and just pump sunshine to them. So I think we're seeing it tip the other way. But what we know about the law is the law lags behind an awful lot of science. Roe versus Wade is a really good example. The law lagged miserably behind what science knew about reproductive health. So back when in 1973, when Roe was decided, the justices were looking at, well, in the first trimester, it's this, in the second, and in the third trimester. And they were trying to balance those things, the right of the fetus against the right of the mom. But that goalpost of when a baby becomes viable has continued to drop to the point where babies sometimes survive at 20 weeks gestation. That was unheard of back in the Supreme Court. Now, I don't want to get into a big discussion about abortion and Roe versus Wade. I'm just using that as an example of where science didn't catch up for a long time to what was really going on, where the law didn't catch up, to science and social norms nearly as fast. We see it all the time in other areas where we just haven't caught up. So I think that as we catch up to brain development and understand and learn more about the human brain and its development in our youth, I think we're going to catch up to a middle ground. And, that doesn't even begin to take into consideration kids who are neurodivergent, kids who are developmentally disabled, and how they fit into the picture. Nancy Allen. Could Chad plead to the children's deaths but go to trial for Tammy? I don't think he'll plead to her death because he wouldn't want to admit he killed his kid's mother. I think that's possible. It is possible for someone to admit and plead to some counts and not others. A lot of that depends on whether the prosecution will agree to try a case only on parts of it. A lot of it would depend on whether the judge would allow that kind of essentially what would be a revision to the indictment. So, there would have to be a lot of variables. I think it is possible that he could enter an Alford plea. Sorry, I've been holding that one in. Thank you for talking about my hair. Just before my daughter's wedding, I broke down and got some highlights, and the little gal that did it, who is the daughter of my neighbor, did a fabulous job. I've gotten lots of comments and compliments on it. It's been great fun. Back to the issue of whether or not Chad would plead to Tammy's murder. He could enter an Alford plea. Now, an Alford plea comes out of and it actually sort of fits this scenario, comes out of a case from the Supreme Court where the defendant was accused of murder. The state was seeking the death penalty. They offered to take the death penalty off the table. And the guy kept saying, I didn't do it, but I want to take advantage of this deal because I want death off the table. And so he entered an Alford. The case was Alford. He entered a plea saying, I don't want to admit I'm guilty, but I agree that the state has could present enough evidence to prove my guilt. So that's the way you get around it. I think that Chad could enter an Alford plea as to Tammy and say, I don't want to admit my guilt, but I I acknowledge that the state has enough evidence to prove me guilty. It is a conviction. It is a finding of guilt, the same as any other finding of guilt, but it allows him to save a little face, and that might be the only thing he can do with his family for Tammy's death. I do think that, good question, Janet, and I will wrap that up. I do think that his family has already heard a lot of this evidence in Lori's trial. And I think they're coming to terms with the fact that he probably was far more involved than they wanted to believe, or that he'd led them to believe. So with an Alford plea, he is not forced to make a public confession or an allocution. With an Alford plea, what they say is, I believe the state has sufficient evidence to prove my guilt. And then the judge will ask the state to repeat the factual basis. So the state presents the facts that they would present at trial that would prove his guilt. So it is not, he does not have to do a confession or an allocution. And, it varies from state to state, but these days, I would say that in most states, entering a guilty plea does not require you to make a full confession or a public allocution. See, this is, you guys are asking these deep questions. You're not asking the lightweight stuff. Hi, Gail. Will all the Arizona evidence be in Chad's trial? This is a good question too. I do believe that they will present Charles's murder the same as they presented it in Lori's case. The difference is Lori was charged and Chad wasn't. But if you remember, that piece of information was not allowed in. So the jury did not know that Lori had been charged or that Chad has not been charged. I do believe that they will bring that in Chad's trial as well. Not for character evidence, but to prove the common scheme or plan. And I think that there is a sufficient, the judge has already let it in Lori's case. So I think we can assume that the judge is going to let it in Chad's case as well. Now, I think that's something that Lori is going to be an issue that Lori's going to appeal. I mean, I think that's going to be up there in the things that she takes umbrage with when it comes to her appeal. But the judge let it in, and I think it will come in Chad's trial as well. Hi, Mary. To me, juveniles are a real conundrum. They don't have the capacity to form mature decisions, but likewise, they shouldn't get away with heinous crimes. What's the answer? I agree, and I often find that I think there has to be some middle ground. I think that in a case where you have a young person who has committed a violent crime, I think that we have to balance the need to protect the public from the need to protect the child. And, I think that age-appropriate treatment and not locking up young offenders with lifer prisoners is a good start. So in most states, young people are not sent to prison, to adult prison, until they age out of the youth authority system. So I think there is a way to find some middle ground. And I think one of the ways that we find that middle ground is that we allow there to be the opportunity for redemption. And that means we allow them the opportunity for parole. Now, it may be that this young person goes right down that road, straight head down, and by the time they are old enough to be in adult prison, that's exactly where they belong. But it is also possible, through programs within the youth authority, that that young person could reform themselves and could um, and could come out of their sentence and be useful members of society. It does happen. I'm not going to tell you it happens a lot. There are a lot more kids that continue on down the road. But I think that if it's possible for even one of them, that we ought to be looking at that option rather than looking at just saying you're 15, rest of your life in prison. Yeah, I don't think that is the answer. But then I'm a defense attorney, and there are a lot of instances where I feel like prison's not the answer. And I have a lovely friend who I am always quick to hold up as my example. If you are friends with me on Facebook, she is one of my Facebook friends, and her name is Nancy Pance, P-A-N-C-E. She, when I first met her, had been the driver of the getaway car in a, I tell this story with her full support. She tells it often, and I am not violating any client confidence by telling this story. I first met her. She was the getaway driver with a couple of other guys who held up at gunpoint one of the local convenience stores in Bend. They were all heavily involved in meth, and all very addicted. And she was probably at her lowest. 3 children had been removed from her because of her drug addiction and her inability to parent them. She was arrested. I met her through the glass in jail, and she was not a happy camper. She was furious. She kept saying, I can't go to prison. And I kept saying, well, I don't have a magic wand, but we'll see. She bailed out. Somebody bailed her out. And she came to my office. And she and I we started out button heads. And I said, look, I'm not a magician. I can't wave a magic wand and make these charges go away. You did an armed robbery. And she finally got clean enough that she was able to understand what had happened. And I said to her, look, this is a mandatory sentence. It's in the mandatory sentence scheme, which in Oregon was ballot measure 11, was what put this mandatory scheme into place. And so I said, the prison term is 7 years, mandatory sentence if you get convicted of this armed robbery. I'm going to do my best to get them to lower the charge and take it out of the measure 11 charge, to give you a lesser charge. And I worked with the DA, and he finally agreed that they would drop it to a lesser charge, and that she would only have to do 3 years, and that in those 3 years she would be eligible for all of the drug treatment programs, for all the education programs in prison, which they're not eligible for if they're under a mandatory sentence. So she wasn't happy about it. And I remember sitting across from her and saying, look, this is as good as it's going to get. So now you need to figure out whether you're going to make the most of this time, or you're going to sit in jail and be bitter and angry and not do anything, because those 3 years are going to pass anyway. The only question I have is, what are you going to do with those 3 years? Are you going to be a better person when you come out of prison, or are you going to be a worse person? And I also represented her in the child welfare case involving one of her children. So I continued to represent her and continued to have contact with her for the next 3 years. She actually didn't serve all 3 years. She was furloughed early out of a drug treatment program, went to a halfway house, to transitional housing, signed up for college, went and got a college degree, and worked the whole time, worked in a call center, worked as I think she did janitorial work. I mean, she just really stayed with it, stayed clean and sober. And this year, well, she's been off of parole now for quite a while. This year, she qualified to have her record expunged. And this year, I had the honor of writing the governor and writing the parole board and recommending that she have her record expunged. She now owns a couple of businesses, and one of them is called Opportunity Oregon. And their entire focus is to find job placements for people coming out of prison, because the statistics are staggering. If people get jobs, they do better and they stay out. So she's working with several community colleges on job training. She works with all of the big employers in the Willamette Valley, placing people who are coming out of prison. And she is winning awards and being recognized for being this amazing advocate and for being this incredible professional. And I couldn't be prouder of her. So if you get a chance and want to get online, look up Nancy Pants, and you will be in awe of her. So I think it's possible. People can redeem themselves. It doesn't happen a lot, but it happens enough that we should all maintain some hope. Oh, hi, this is a good question. We didn't talk about Murdaugh tonight, but let's talk about with Alex retracting his statement in the Satterfield insurance fraud case, doesn't that show even more that he committed fraud by backtracking? Oh, absolutely. I mean, all it does is continue to prove that he's a liar, that he will lie about anything. So, and his whole purpose in lying about the Satterfield case is that there's a $4.3 million judgment that he agreed to. He gave them a confession of judgment saying, I'm responsible, and yes, you need to get this money from me. Now, I don't know what South Carolina court would do with that. I'm not an expert in South Carolina law. In some states, the court would say, we don't want to unjustly enrich somebody if they are collecting a judgment. In this case, Eric Bland represents the Satterfield family, and they have been, no, I'm sorry. Is that right? Yeah. And they, the Satterfield sons went back against all of the people who should have kept Alec Murdaugh from stealing their money. So they went back against the partners in Alec's firm, and they went back against the bank, Palmetto State Bank, for not supervising Alec and making sure that he was meeting his fiduciary duties. And they were able to collect money, and they've collected more. I want to say it's somewhere around $7 million. $7 million. I felt like I mumbled that. From those folks. Now, that is a separate legal action from going after Alec for stealing the money. It's a separate legal action. So they have not sued Alec to collect that judgment. And I don't know what the South Carolina court would do about that, because they have collected money and been made more than made whole by other people. And there's a lot of different thinking about why should Alec Murdaugh get off scot-free because other people paid for their negligence. So I think that's going to be a question for South Carolina. The important thing to know is that the Satterfield sons, they're grown-ups, I don't like to call them boys. The Satterfield sons didn't collect any money from Nautilus Insurance, which is the company that paid out the claim and the money that Alec stole. So there isn't any chance they're going to have to pay back money to Nautilus because it was stolen from them. So Nautilus's beef is with Murdaugh and not with the Satterfield sons. Absolutely. I mean, lying about another lie just proves that you're a liar. So yeah, he committed fraud by taking back what he said. Either was lying then or he's lying now, and either way, he's a liar. So he's certainly not getting any more believable or credible as time goes on, and more charges stack up. Now he's got all these federal charges. So good questions. What do I think of Aiden Fucci? So just as I believe that there are young people who we need to find a middle ground for, and we need to at least give them the opportunity for their brain development to finish and for them to grow and for them to perhaps redeem themselves. I also believe that there are instances where people should never be free again. And I believe that in the case of Aiden Fucci, he should never be free again. This was such a clear case of premeditation and such a clear case of this being a thrill kill. I have some really serious concerns about him ever being out again. Yeah. So, I mean, he is definitely the exception that proves the rule, I guess, because I don't think he should ever be outside of some sort of supervision. Hi, Rebe. Is there a certain cutoff date for Chad to take an Alford plea, guilty plea, etc., before the 1st of April? Nope, he can do it the day the trial starts. He could do it mid-trial. You get into the question of if a jury's been seated, do we run into double jeopardy problems if for some reason he were to withdraw his plea after he enters a plea? But you certainly could. I've seen cases where people plead guilty in the middle of trial. In fact, his own lawyer did it. For those of you who might be new to the case and not realize that John Pryor had some criminal charges, some charges against him for inappropriate touching with a woman who came into his office. And it was charged as a felony. And about halfway through the trial, he took a deal that made it a misdemeanor so that he could keep his law license. Because in most states, if you're convicted of a felony, you can't keep your license. So he did it himself. So Chad could plead even after the trial starts. Do we know if a plea deal is even on the table for Chad? I think a plea deal has been on the table for Chad for a while. What the substance is and what the state is willing to agree to is the question. But certainly a plea deal would be on the table. The prosecution doesn't want to retry this case. They've already tried it once, and it was grueling. And if given the opportunity to take death off the table when it's already off the table for Lori, and avoid appeals, avoid the appeal that there might have been under the equal protection part of the Constitution, if they want to avoid all that, they just take death off the table and make him a deal. And I think that is highly likely. But I don't think we will know until after Lori is sentenced, because I don't think anybody's going to talk about what an appropriate sentence would be for Chad, for the state to agree to for Chad, until they see what the judge is going to do with Lori. I mean, let's just say, total speculation. The judge says, I've decided that instead of life without parole, I'm going to give her life with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Well, Chad wouldn't want to have already settled his case for life without parole and then find out that Lori managed to eke out a sentence that was less than that. So, I mean, I don't think that's going to happen, but, you know, the cautious practitioner would be saying, I'm not going to entertain a deal until we see what Lori gets. So, yeah, but I'm sure there's a deal on the table. The prosecution would be foolish not to have a deal on the table, because they don't want another 6-week trial. And this one, if they continue on with the death penalty, is going to be way longer, because they've got to do a mitigation, a sentencing phase. So, and, you know, the death penalty is not a sure thing, because they still have to do the sentencing phase. Hi, Tiff Knox. Any thoughts on possible Oregon, Washington serial killer on the loose with those 6 bodies recently found? Yeah, I did comment on it earlier. Law enforcement is saying they have not made a connection between these deaths. Now, I certainly, you know, it's not outside the realm of possibility. But what I understand about serial killers is that they tend to be a little more localized. So these bodies were found in a 100-mile radius. Some were found in Washington, over in Vancouver, Washington. Some were found in Oregon. So in a 100-mile radius of Portland. Now, there have been serial killers like the Happy Face Killer, who was a truck driver, who dumped bodies everywhere. But typically, we see them in a more condensed area. Law enforcement is saying they don't see connections, but they're still investigating. So it's possible, but I don't think anybody is sounding the alarm. Now, you know, there have been serial killers in the Portland area. There's a very famous one, at least in Portland. His name is Dayton Leroy Rogers. He is on death row in Oregon, and he was called the Molalla Forest Killer because all of his victims, the bodies were dumped in a forested area out near the city of Molalla, which is a sort of a distant town outside of Portland. And he was notorious because he had a foot thing. And so sometimes bodies would be found with the feet in other locations. So serial killers tend to have favorite dumping grounds. Green River Killer always had places that he concentrated bodies. Not always, but it would kind of be surprising, I would think, for there to be a 100-mile radius around the city of Portland and for them to all be connected. There may be some of them that are, But law enforcement is not jumping to that conclusion. So it's been kind of sensationalized already. We're seeing Law and Crime and News Nation jump right on it. But I'm not convinced yet that they have a serial killer in Portland. Hi, Rachel. Could the Daybell kids give victim impact statements at Lori's sentencing? Will they? They certainly could, because their mother is a victim, and they certainly will be asked whether they want to give victim impact statements. In most places, they don't have to appear personally. The victim advocate can read statements. They don't have to appear personally in court. So I think it's possible that there could be impact statements from Chad's kids about their mom. I don't know. They've stayed pretty quiet and pretty under the radar. And I guess it would be hard to come to court and give a victim impact statement about the impact the death of your mother had on your life and still support your father, who's still awaiting trial on the same charges. So I guess it really would depend on where the kids are in their belief about the crimes. And I don't think they're all in lockstep. I think that they are varying in the ways that they feel about Chad's involvement. So, I mean, you could have some who file statements and some who don't. Will we get the list of who plans to give a victim impact statement early? I doubt it. We didn't get witness lists. We never got witness lists. I doubt it. And I don't know that that the court is required to produce a list of who's going to appear. Hi, Edie Ruth. I'm not familiar with Aiden Fucci. Can you give a quick rundown? Aiden Fucci was a juvenile, Florida, I think, but I could be wrong, since I don't have all the facts at my fingertips. He was young. He lured a young girl who was his friend into the woods and then savagely murdered her. It was an awful, awful case. And he's definitely, I mean, it's hard when you hear the facts of that case and the way that he planned it and the way that he talked about it ahead of time. It's really hard not to see that he is profoundly disturbed and really needs never to be free. I'm sure there are folks in chat that have more are more conversant with the facts and have them more readily available than I do. So if anybody else wants to chime in, feel free. Hi, Treelandon. Anything on the guy in jail for the Delphi murders? That's Richard Allen, and he is still in prison or is still in jail. I don't believe they've set a trial date for him. Keegan Kline, who was the young man who from a neighboring town who was catfishing one of the girls and having contact with him online under the guise of being some hunky guy. He's really a kind of creepy overweight guy who was hanging out in his mom's basement. He has been in. Lots of people want to know whether or not there's a connection between him and Richard Allen. He says there is not. He says he doesn't know Richard Allen, never had any contact with him. Um, so I think probably my biggest concern with Richard Allen is his health is really failing. And I think there's a possibility he could die in prison or in jail before he gets to trial. So I'm hoping that folks will pick up the pace, because I think it would be really hard for the families to not have that closure. So we'll see. But his trial date, I don't believe, has been set yet. I think I'd have to dig through a whole stack here of my last week's notes. I think there is a motion to suppress hearing on some evidence coming up at the end of the month. And after that, then I think they'll be ready to set a trial date. Hi, Beverly. Do we know if Chad's kids have visited him? We don't. I have sent a FOIA request for the jail logs, but I have not heard anything yet from the jail. So I'm going to keep pressing ahead trying to get information, but at this point, we don't know. I have been told by somebody whose information I find credible and who lives in the local area that Chad has photographs of his children and of Tammy in his cell and not of Lori. So, but I don't know whether they're visiting him. And it could be that they're talking by telephone and not physically visiting, or they could be talking over video conference. I certainly think that it's hard for people to come in and out of the jail without attracting media attention. And so they may be just communicating electronically with him. So, my goodness, my voice held out for almost 2 hours. So I think we will start wrapping up. Hi, Milana Hansen. Do you think law officers would consider using the algorithm from Murder Accountability Project to assess the occurrences in Oregon? You know, I don't know that much about Murder Accountability Project. I know that there are applications that try to compare many points of data points to come up with a profile of a not of the person, but a profile of the crime, and then to see whether other crimes fit into that profile. And I think it's possible, but I think it's just going to be pure, good old fashioned police work and shoe leather, just running down leads, talking to people who knew these women, and looking to find out whether or not there's a common connection between them. You know, I mean, in a lot of serial killer cases, we see some sort of either a profile or a common connection in the victim. So, you know, looking at Ted Bundy's murders, he murdered college co-eds. They all had dark hair parted down the middle, which if you'd seen me in the 70s, I would have looked just like one of his victims. You know, Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, targeted prostitutes, and he had a real problem with prostitutes, so he targeted them. So, you know, I think sometimes it's just starting to make connections, talking to family members, talking to friends, and trying to find where there might be a connection and what might connect any of those women to a particular person. So, you know, I mean, I think all tools are on the table. I'm not There's been a lot of discussion about artificial intelligence and people using AI to write books. And I don't know. I wouldn't do it, but I don't know that I feel one way or the other about it. I think that if people are using artificial intelligence to create things, I think we should know it. But I don't really care one way or the other. I'm not going to use artificial intelligence to write my book. I'm going to use plain old hard work and research and experience. So, I think anytime you're using algorithms, artificial intelligence, any of those things, I think it's just another tool in their tool belt. Let's take a couple more questions if you've got them out there, Michelle. Otherwise, we'll wrap up. We learned that Murdoch has a tablet and can Skype outside people. Does Lori have one too? She does. The jail system, they do have access to iPads or some sort of a tablet. And they do have the ability to video conference with people on the outside. A lot of it depends on it is more restrictive in jail. Once you're sentenced and you go to prison, probably a little bit less restricted in who you can contact. But these aren't tablets that have unlimited access to the internet. They can't get on the internet and, but they do get emails, and they do, they can, in some limited capacity, do some research, and they can, in some limited capacity, have video conferencing. And they certainly can do that with their lawyers and with their family. Edie Ruth, who won the coffee bet? I won the coffee bet because Lori didn't testify. So we'll have to settle that up. But the pound of coffee was on whether or not Lori would testify. Lots of folks felt that she would because she is so narcissistic, but I kind of thought she wouldn't. Gail Clark, question: will you read the audiobook for your new book? I don't know. In most cases, audiobooks, publishers hire professionals to narrate books. Some authors like to narrate their own books. I don't really have an opinion one way or the other. I will say that authors who I have talked to who have recorded their own books will tell you it's a grueling experience. It is 8 hours a day in a sound booth and take after take. And if you have somebody who is an experienced audiobook narrator, you have much less of that fits and starts. And so I don't know. I'll entertain that if my publisher approaches me. If not, then I am certain that they will find somebody who you all will enjoy listening to. Like most people, I don't like the sound of my own voice. Most people don't. I got a little bit used to it when I'd get a trial recording and I'd have to listen to me myself. But so I don't know yet. As far as I know, there will be an audio book that was part of my my publishing contract, and so I hope that we'll be looking at an audiobook production along with the printed book. Thank you, Michelle. I want to thank everybody who's here tonight. We had a little over 500 folks here, and that's a good night. I'll tell you, during the trial, we were getting 1,100, 1,200 people in the chat, and that was amazing. But now that things have calmed down a little bit and we're talking about other cases, I'm excited that we've got 500 people on a Wednesday night. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for always being so supportive. You're always really kind to me, and I appreciate it. I appreciate your kindness for Michelle. She works really hard to make our chat friendly and welcoming. And so I appreciate all of you who support her. All of the Super Chats and PayPals go directly to her. So I'm going to give my voice a rest. And I really feel much better than I sound, but I'm going to give my voice a rest and say goodnight. Have a great week. And we'll be back on next Wednesday to talk about what's going on in the true crime world. Thanks for joining us, and have a great night. Good night.